All right, all right, all right, all right. Hey, everybody, welcome to Old Weird Houston. Thank you. Please clap. I'm Pete Gershon. I'm the curator of programs here. We're really happy you're all here. I just want to say a couple things before we have our first speaker come up. First of all, if you haven't already, make sure you get your Old Weird Houston passport. They're at the check-in table in the front. And if you get your passport fully stamped, we've promised you some swag, which we don't actually have, but we're going to find some. It's all going to work out just fine. I want to tell you a couple things about who we are and what we do and where you're at. Can we get the slide presentation up? Yeah, all right, great. We got a copy of this presentation. All right. You're here at the Orange Show World Headquarters, and we're the Orange Show Center for Visionary Art. We maintain and program this right here. Perhaps you're familiar with the world-famous Orange Show. We also have a beer can house. And we have a Smither Park. I know it's a little hard to see. We've got this glare, and as the day goes on, it's going to be easier to see these presentations. I want to tell you a little bit about the artwork that surrounds us. This is the work of Maria Chavez. She was our artist in residence throughout the month of March. And she's a conceptual sound artist, and she has created this sound-absorbing, found fabric, monumental sculpture that she worked on with a group of about 20 U of H students while she was here. Feel free to lounge about on the beanbags. This is a view from the opening performance. It was really exciting. She did workshops with kids and adults where she trained them in her technique of smashing records and piling them up on the turntable. It's really fun. You should Google Maria Chavez and check her out. She's breaking some records here with some kids. You're here at 2334 Gulf Terminal Drive, and here's an aerial view from the 1940s. Look, there's absolutely nothing here. There's a little bit of the neighborhood, but this is just a big blank spot in the middle. This is 1952, Houston Chronicle. Trucking firm buys terminal site just off freeway. That's where we're at right now. You can see in the view here, this is a 1948 image of the Gulf Freeway, and you can see Munger Street. Nothing on it at that point. Jeff McKissick, you're going to hear all about Jeff, the builder of the Orange Show, throughout the day. And you can see in this picture from the 1970s, this truck depot being used exactly for what it was built for, being a truck depot. In subsequent years, it was a pallet factory. If anybody came here all through the 90s, Audis, teens, you would have seen big stacks of pallets everywhere, 10-foot stacks. And I've talked to a couple people who came over to this property and started walking through these many 10-foot stacks of pallets and then got completely lost in a pallet maze. Back of the Orange Show, somewhat obscured by the artwork, but if you get a chance to peek out and look, you will see a completely unadorned back of the Orange Show. Was never meant to be seen from this direction. You can kind of imagine the dudes working in this space all through the time that Jeff was building it, looking out over there, seeing a guy welding these wagon wheels into place. Hard to imagine what they were thinking. We got some nice horses tied up here when the trail riders came through a few weeks ago. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say for now. I'm going to be bothering you throughout the day, but we have Robert Kimberly here is going to talk to us about Byrd, but also the Bible Cyclorama. Do you want to come up here and run it and speak, or you want to run from there?
Like to, if possible.
All right, you do you.
Check, check. 1, 2. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, please.
We're going to wait for a minute while they turn off the music. I just can't compete. Is there a way to get the HDMI into projector? Perfect, thank you. Hi everyone, my name's Robert Kimberly and I'm with the Byrd Digital Archive. If anyone doesn't know what that is, what it is it's an archive dedicated to the writings of a Houston columnist who was writing from 1947 to 54 for the Houston Press and eventually went on to the Houston Chronicle. And he's actually the way I got introduced to the main topic of this presentation, which is about the Houston Bible Cyclorama, which was a massive round church based off of Shepherd, built in the early 30s, open until the mid 50s, and deeply strange and wonderful, actually. So I hope you find it as interesting as I do. First, a little bit about Sig and why I'm here. Yep, I'm just checking to make sure I can see my slides. Yeah, so he wrote in the 40s, 50s, and even 60s, wrote immensely about just about all sorts of people. He wrote columns called The Stroller. He talked about burning through shoes, many pairs of shoes per month and year, walking through Houston, which is why he eventually wrote about Mel Morris. Mel Morris is the eventual creator of the Bible Cyclorama, who had a fascinating history prior to his arrival in Houston and a deeply weird and interesting career prior to becoming an evangelical minister who used a very distinct and visual process of teaching the Bible. Mel was actually, in the 20s and 30s, extremely well known in the neon technology community, wrote columns, wrote publications, wrote all sorts of things. He comes from a deeply scholastic or a very technical background, visual background, also participated in, and this is relative eventually to his founding of the Bible Cyclorama, I promise. He covered something called the patent wars. And at the time during the Great Depression, the neon industry was going through great upheaval as it got consolidated from smaller companies into bigger ones. And there is a Cal State Fullerton professor who has gone into great detail about his early part of his career. And she actually speculates that maybe it's a result of this neon upheaval in the industry that might have brought him into becoming a minister as a result of his displeasure and disillusionment with the industry that he was so passionate about. I'm going to start posting some images of his publications and headlines, and you'll start, at least I start finding that there's a correlation between the way his images and text look, and that eventually the way the materials that he's generated and produced for his church, there seems to be this interesting line of continuity, and I hope to present that to you and make that clear to you later. This is one of the first images that he created that I see is eventually a through line to his Bible Cyclorama presentations. This is a diagram of how neon works. It was in one of his early publications, either in the late 20s or early 30s. I'm not as good about recalling that information right now, as I'm not a public speaker and this is my first presentation. So I hope to get, thank you. My wife heard it yesterday. It'll be much better today. More information on Mel Morris. It shows that these clippings show that in the 20s he was in Miami and Florida, which will be relevant later in the 40s and 50s for Mel. He's seen as a universal light, working as a representative of universal light. And again, I promise this all relates to Houston. This is a publication he was involved with. And to the right is a front page which shows that he had a company in town, at least a post office box in the 30s, relating, mail being sent to Houston. So he'd already started residing in Houston, and eventually got himself involved with the Hyde Park Church, which will be the springboard for his specialty-built church on Shepherd. These are neon patents. Again, this imagery reminds me of his teachings later on. And the way he came about is eventually he left the industry seemingly altogether. This seemed to correspond with his interest in a man named Antonio Futterer. I've never heard his name pronounced out loud, so apologies if I'm mangling it, who is based out in California. Futterer developed a methodology of teaching the Bible, which Mel completely latched onto. It's called an iographic method of teaching the Bible. The eventual workbooks that Futterer sold and presented around the country are these deeply visual, diagrammatic ways of teaching the Bible. They're chock full of imagery and text. They almost have a technical, diagrammatic quality to them that I just think is really appealing to myself, but also I think is what Mel gravitated to, because it seemed probably a logical extension of a way of advocating and informing people. While Futterer developed this iographic methodology, there was a predecessor to him named Clarence Larkin, who made these dispensational charts. And these dispensational charts are a storytelling method of explaining events in the Bible. And again, very cohesive, very logical in their storytelling, but also just very interesting to me in terms of how they present Bible story in a visual format that at the time, these diagrams, these images were often seen in tent revival churches. They were sold to ministers and preachers all around the country. And so this imagery would have been something seen throughout presentations in rural and urban America as part of these tent revivals and church presentations in buildings as well. Often it seemed like they were non-denominational. So instead of a church just utilizing this material, it seemed like traveling preachers used it as well. Now, to the main part. In the 30s, Mel Morris, who had been working for the Hyde Park Church, presents this in the Houston Chronicle. Started in 1932, the church started building a large drum-shaped church on Shepherd, just a little south of West Alabama, and a little north of what would have been the 59 had it existed back then. This church was tailor-made to showcase a 200-foot-long circular painting, an endless painting. Eventually, Mel cited it as the full history of the Bible from creation to infinity. And you'll see what's fantastic is the Houston Metropolitan Center for Research Center has some fantastic interior pictures of it. So I'm really fortunate that I'll be able to show you exactly what Mel was presenting to the public. What I do find really interesting about this church, and you'll see it in the pictures, is it's almost the opposite of what a normal church might be, which has huge amounts of natural light coming into it. This church had no stained glass, and seemingly the windows on the exterior did not really kind of go into the central dome and drum of the building, meaning all the presentation of the Cyclorama painting and other support material, which there was some of, was illuminated by neon light and other lighting. So there is a deeply technical electrical spectacle going on in that church that is almost the opposite of most churches. To me, I feel like when he got the church up and running and was doing his presentations, he was almost competing against theater and cinema in terms of what he was going against, or using for his own purposes the same techniques of cinema and theater to bring the word of the Bible to seemingly thousands of people in Houston. The building was being built in the 30s, He was not always on site overseeing the fabrication of the building itself, as he and his wife were often going around the country, but often hosting tent revivals on the property as the building was still in its construction phase. The Houston Chronicle is just filled with articles about the Bible Cyclorama's programmings, not written by reporters, but submitted by the Cyclorama itself, there are huge amounts of pages that are just full of events from other churches. So amongst the many, many, many churches in Houston, the Cyclorama was presenting its offerings. The paintings. An artist named A.E. Anderson, who at the time of his passing was living off of Old Spanish Trail, so I believe him to be a Houston-based artist, but I haven't been able to dig in deeply about his history yet because there's certainly not much about him. This is the beginnings of this. The painting as its main teaching device in the church was one of many things that Morris eventually got up and running. I do love this next slide because it is so enjoyably bizarre. I wish I could find pictures of the religious robot that he had proselytizing at the church in the 30s. This robot is later described as an electromechanical man who was wearing, I believe, a gray military outfit, but I'd have to dig through my findings. Amongst, pun intended, the holy grails of this research is pictures of the robot and other imagery from this place, which I think in description is so distinctive and so unique, even to what I think are most like-minded ministers. He put out publications frequently or fairly regularly. This is one of them. This was on sale on Amazon, and I am sad to have found it long after its sale. It sounds fascinating, but within it is included a diagram which to me harkens back to some of the Larkin charts and the sort of neon technology diagramming. Also included in that book is a picture of the cyclorama itself. This is what the cyclorama looked like in 1947. It's large, it's distinct, and I even found in the aerial photography of it, there's aerial photography in the research center where you can see this building from the sky. And at the time in 47, years after the building was opened, there was still not much around it, at least directly around the property. So there would have been enough property to do a tent revival around it, but the inside is what really brought people in. Work on the roof going on. So I'll get to more pictures of the interior, but I do want to talk about Mel's interest in the technology and this slide is out of order is what I'm getting to. Mel wrote about the atomic bomb in the Bible. He wrote that he believed that there were atomic bomb blasts that took place historically in the Bible, which I find, again, fascinating, and also just like a contemporary adaptation of technology informing a person who is proselytizing. And let me see if Here's Mel. Pardon? The images that I'm presenting? The question was, where can you see these images in person? I got these. These are negatives that were scanned for me at the Houston Metropolitan Research Center, and literally I only discovered these last week. And they graciously, I don't know if they expedited the scan or they had the time to do that, but between my visit on the weekend and this presentation, they had them fully scanned for me. Pardon? I'm sorry. I can talk to me afterwards, and I'd be happy to tell you how to find this information. Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me a little better. So this is the interior of the cyclorama. This seems to be the equivalent of his pulpit, not in the side of the building, but in the center of it, where he could pan around the 360 painting and showcase the different lessons that were incorporated into the imagery. Here is an unnamed painter who is working on it right now. I don't know, I can't remember where within the process they are. I don't believe these are dated, but I expect them to be in the mid to late 30s. What I really love about this as a person who works in genie lifts and scaffolds is how sketchy that scaffold looks. It's wooden, and it also appears to be tied off to various parts of the cyclorama itself. Doorknobs, chairs, I don't know, railings maybe, but it seems very un-OSHA approved. Here's the painter kind of continuing to work on the painting itself. Again, this is meant to be an encyclopedic understanding of the Bible. And so in the newspaper articles that touch upon what he's teaching there just seem to be a myriad of topics that are touched upon. And apparently what would happen is they would open the doors, they would have people come in, and at a certain point they would close the doors, just like a movie theater, and then they would go on with whatever the lessons of that day were. And apparently, the lights would move, not just the ones that Mel held, but there was sort of a choreography to the neon lighting that added an element of spectacle and theatricality to these presentations, which I think is inherently built into the process and something that Mel developed and thrived on. This is not just your typical reading from the Bible. This is something much, much more, and I love it. So the Cyclorama opened in 1937 after its construction, and almost seemingly immediately after its opening, Mel divorced his wife, who saw him through this whole process. He'd apparently, and this all comes from Byrd, which is great because you would never get this information from any of the public record about the church. Mel met a widowed woman who was part of his church. His wife at the time felt she had to share Mel with everybody, and this widow took that to heart. Mel eventually left Houston and went back to Florida, where he had started working in neon back in the day, and eventually started a ministry called the Temple of the Pictured Truth, which is another visual pictographic Bible study place. And so in the meantime, he left his wife to kind of manage the church. And during World War II, he was gone. During World War II, he was gone. So the church was kind of closed down a little bit at the time, and eventually they brought back a minister. They brought a minister in. This minister came recommended, but she did not know him. And in her absence, when she went to visit a family member, I get to read this. This is great. Well, first I'll read the first column from Byrd's article because it kind of shows how charismatic, but also eventually what the wife had to contend with in this process of dealing with the Bible Cyclorama. See if I can find that quote. Mrs. Melvin Morris, the present owner of the Unusual Building, this coming from an unpublished column from the Houston Press in, I believe, 1947 or 46. Mrs. Melvin Morris, the current owner of the Unusual Building, has borne many crosses in those 16 years since it opened. Probably the heaviest cross was her former husband, the late Reverend Mr. Melvin Morris, an erratic genius who had been called the father of animated advertising because of monuments in glittering neon signs designed and built under his patents reaching from the Times Square to Tijuana. Under his ministry, the Cyclorama prospered, but there came into his life a wealthy widow, a disciple of his from Missouri, and with her coming, the serpent crept into this Morris Eden. Mrs. Morris, who today is a handsome woman, had herself been wed once before, although she was a widow at the time of her marriage to Mr. Morris. So she tried to tell herself that she must share her husband's genius with others. But it was difficult. So eventually, after building this huge, complicated, and unique church, he pretty much left Houston temporarily. because he went to Miami, and then he decided to come back and try to win his wife back. And then he decided not to. And then he went back to Miami and apparently married the church secretary that was still in Miami, or Florida, excuse me. So after his absence and eventual death in 1947, his wife continued to run the church, but because it was non-denominational and did not have a congregation that was continually there repeatedly, it seems that it did not bode well for the future of the finances of the church. In 1950, there is this Houston Chronicle magazine article that touches upon the church itself. Excuse me. But after that, come the mid-50s, the end was near. And the article started showing up, showing that the Bible Cyclorama was for sale. Byrd wrote about this, the decline of the church and its eventual sale. And in the mid-50s, it was torn down. But that's not the end of the paintings, fortunately. So in 1971, there was an article that was talking about what happened to the Bible Cyclorama. The building itself was torn down and salvaged, but the murals themselves have a history that lasted after the dismantling of the church. At one point, the murals were going to be salvaged by a Florida-based church, which I speculate might have been Sig's old church in St. Petersburg, Florida. But in the writings, it said that the crew that came to try to dismantle them, because the paintings were monstrously huge and built on panels, was unsuccessful. A couple articles talk about churches or a church that tried to salvage them, either the Bethesda Baptist Church, which doesn't seem to actually exist back in that time, so I think it's the wrong attribution, or St. Luke's Baptist Church, which did exist at the time. The paintings were reported to have been moved to the garage of a former deacon whose name is Sam Holly. And in 1971, he said the sections of paintings, which were like 18 feet by 6 foot, filled his garage to a degree. He did not have a chance to review the paintings after they arrived there, and it didn't sound like in the article, I'm only inferring, that he wasn't thrilled with their presence because they took up so much room. So, in 1971, it's reported that those paintings still existed. And after that article, I have no idea where they are. So, if anyone knows Sam Holly, anyone, I am eagerly researching the church that he was affiliated with, his name, and whether or not there is any remnant of those paintings left. I expect that either Sam Holly, or maybe after his passing, if he's passed, relatives were like, no, this is going to the junkyard. We need our garage back. Thanks, Dad. So, on that note, can I take any questions? Well, thank you for coming to this. I'm really thrilled to present on as best I can tell, there wasn't any real coverage besides the columns or the material that they were providing to the newspapers for its like weekly coverage in the dedicated page that was revolved around activities of churches. So there wasn't sort of a reporter going and talking about it. But from what I gathered, this is not out of the norm in terms of proselytizing and churches. Of course, there are more typical churches in permanent buildings. But this sort of very dramatic, visual, evangelical process seemed to be one that was around both in cities and the tent revivals that were traveling. It seems to me the visual material was produced in part to be provided to ministers as sort of a ready-made material that they could present. And I feel like it was almost like, buy the books, buy the banners, buy the material, and you have everything you need to go out and proselytize. And Mel Morris's version of this was the largest and most permanent version of this iographic visual process. And even in his writings, which I believe he wrote that he has used Larkin charts and used Footer's methodology and designs and expanded upon them. So it seems like this is the largest, most spectacle-like culmination of this iographic visual dispensational chart process. But again, I don't know what the feedback was, but there are loads of newspaper articles. Morris had a 5-week-long pictorial prophetic conference in Alabama, 5 weeks of this. So he was probably out in tents presenting this information and getting people to attend. And the Cyclorama itself, I don't know the total amount of people that could seat in it, but the seating, what I could tell, I think they can seat about 200 or 300 people inside of it. So if they were filling the pews, filling the seats at the time, I would think he was getting a large congregation, initially at least. And I think I don't think it was seen as cult-like. I think it was just seen as another version of Christianity, a very different flavor of it. So you're asking about the location of the Cyclorama. I believe it is kind of close to where the current Randall's is. I need to research more. It was noted at the intersection of Shepherd and Herald, and that was I believe the Chevrolet dealership is the one that eventually owned and tore down the Cyclorama itself. So the question was the church location picked as a competitor to a neighboring church? And I don't know. Some of that, I think in part it might have been chosen just because it was a big property that was available. So it would have allowed both for the construction of the church and also simultaneous tent revivals that could have taken place either during or simultaneously to the opening of the building itself. So I'm going to be here for a little bit longer. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer any questions or provide any resources that I used to present this information. Thanks for coming.
Hey, thanks again, Robert Kimberly. That was really cool. Appreciate you. And stick around, mingle, explore. We're going to have our next speaker here at 11:30. That's going to be Thorin Dreyer talking about Space City News. Also, check out this display of mannequins and taxidermy that Jim Pirtle brought over from Natsuo. Our own display of Orange Show, Beer Can House, Flower Man, etc. memorabilia, as well as the Hyde Park Miniature Museum. We're going to be talking about that more later on. Stick around.
Do you have a card? Do you have a website where this information I can look at it? So the information, so I don't have any online resources for this presentation yet. Okay. But what you can start tracking down is the Byrd Digital Archive on both Facebook and on WordPress. It's a compendium of his columns. And I answer messages. I will respond to any messaging sent to, especially Facebook.
Okay. Because I would be interested in reading the articles about the Cyclorama.
Basically, Sigbird's column, which I can forward to you.
Sigbird's column.
There are two columns. There's one from the Houston Chronicle that's available through the
the Houston Library System's access to the?
Right now, no, but the
That
materials
it
are
was
about-
his. This is
about
mine
the
from
Cyclorama.
before. I'm just
I mean,
making
great
sure
to
this
get
is
online somewhere.
not
I
affected.
well, they
by,
all
it seems
are
like everything's
online.
sold.
The newspaper columns are available.
Great. And I'm gonna
Do you know
play.
about the Houston Chronicle's archive?